Hello everybody, hope you're having a wonderful day so far, and this is lesson number 5 in our delve into the wonderful world of music theory. Usually more enthusiastic when I'm saying that, but you get the point. And today we're going to be talking about clefs. It's a funny word, isn't it? Well, it's a funny word that's very important to music, especially about how we read music. So in the previous lesson, I'm sure you'll recall, we talked about a little bit about how we write down pitch, how we represent pitch in written music. And we said that, well, music is written on 5 lines. And these are apparently a very bad set of 5 lines, but yes, music is written on 5 lines. And depending on where I place a note in those 5 lines, I could place it maybe on a line, or I could place it in a space, the space between 2 lines. Depending on where I place this note on the staff, that tells me which pitch that note corresponds to. And we even learned that pitches, as we move higher up, that the pitches higher up on the staff are higher than the pitches lower. For example, my note here is higher than this note because it's higher up on the staff. And if any of this is confusing you, I encourage you to go watch my previous lesson. We went into very detail in that. As you can see, my previous lesson is right here. But that's the gist of what we covered. And now many of you might come to the natural question. Now one of the natural questions is that, well, okay, but then how do I know which exact pitch it corresponds to? Okay, I know this one's higher than that one, but what is this one? Well, if I had to play it in the piano, what would it be? And that's one natural question which we'll be answering today through Clefs. But another question which you might have is what I'm going to pose to you today. So as you can see, I've got the full piano here. It's the full grand piano, right? And this covers most of the pitches that you will find in music. There are very, very few instruments that play below the lowest key on the piano, and very, very few instruments that play higher than the highest key in the piano. So most musical instruments that are in common use today come somewhere in this range. And after taking my last lesson, another natural question you might have is, well, there are 88 keys on this grand piano, but there are only 5 lines. And even if you use spaces, what can I get? Maybe 9, maybe maximum 10, 11, 12, 12 pitches. But how am I supposed to write 88 pitches on just these 5 lines? And that would be a very valid question. And one way we get around that is by making small lines above the staff, like this. Now these lines are called ledger lines, and as you might imagine, they allow us to extend what we're writing with from just 5 lines to more, so that we can write notes that are higher than the highest line or lower than the lowest line. But you don't have to worry about too much about these ledger lines right now. We'll be going in depth to what they mean, how they work, how you place notes and stuff later on in this course. But just thought I'd give them a shout out here. And the problem with using ledger lines alone to solve this problem is that we can't do this endlessly. Well, we can do it endlessly, but we can't. Then it becomes a very big hassle to read and to write. Can you imagine reading 10 of these lines like this? Can you imagine reading some music like that? And it's an extremely inconvenient way to write the music as well. So this is of course a inefficient, inconvenient, and a pretty bad way to write music. Writing with 10, 15 lines. So to compensate for this, the other way we get around this whole problem of fitting 88 pitches in just these 5 lines is by using clefs. Now beat around the bush long enough. Let's talk about what clefs are. Well, clefs are the symbols that you put at the beginning of a staff, and they help us. They serve one main purpose, and that is to tell us which line and space, should really be and or, correspond to which sorry about that, which pitch. So which line and space correspond to which pitch? And of course this answers our first question. So clefs, while just the staff is not going to tell me which note is which key on the piano, by putting a clef here, by putting that symbol, it's going to tell me which line and which space correspond to which keys on the piano. And they won't just tell me like E, F. They'll you can, by looking at music where a clef is present, you can narrow down exactly which key on the piano any given one of these notes means. What they correspond to is a better way of putting it. And just to give you intuition, and by the way, plural, and some of you may already notice that. So, and I'm going to get to how this solves our second problem. So maybe I have some clef A, right? Maybe some clef. We'll get to how to write clefs later on, and that makes this line correspond to maybe, I don't know, E. I could have another clef, a different clef, maybe some new one, B, and now with that clef, the same line corresponds to, I don't know, a G. So that is kind of a bomb to drop on you because that's a lot of information, but just think about it. So clefs fundamentally, their main purpose is to tell us which line and space correspond to which pitch. So when I put a note here, which key on the piano are we talking about? And you can have multiple. So maybe under one clef, this bottom line means E, but on another clef, that bottom line might mean G, or maybe A, or maybe C. And the more perceptive of you might realize that this very neatly solves our problem, and I'll get to how. So I've already done it for myself, which is probably something I shouldn't have done, but imagine let's divide the piano into some broad sections. In fact, let's cut it in half, which I've done here. So let's take broadly the right side roughly and the left side. Now what I can do is I can have one clef which makes these 5 lines pretty high. Which makes these 5 lines somewhere here, maybe pretty high. And I use that clef whenever I want to talk about high instruments. For example, the violin's not going to be playing down there, the flute's not going to be playing down here. No, they're going to be playing up here, right? So when I only want to talk about high stuff, I use a clef that makes these lines pretty high. And maybe when I want to use a low instrument, I don't know, a cello or a double bass or a bassoon, I use a clef that makes these 5 lines pretty low. Again, lots of information, and we'll just be repeating this throughout the class and sort of understanding how this works. But indeed, that is what we do in music. So we sort of roughly divide the piano into 2 halves, and we say, well, when I'm talking about one half, I'm going to use the right half. When I'm talking about the right half, right, I'm going to use the treble clef, the high half, the right half. And this in music means high, treble clef. And maybe when I want to talk about the low half of the piano, the lower half, the left half, I'll use something called the bass clef. And indeed, these are the 2 main pitches that we have in music, the treble clef and the bass clef. There are multiple more, but you don't need to worry about those at all. So the treble clef and bass clef. And again, let's get an intuitive understanding. Let's just sort of recap what this means. So I've not spoken pretty practically till now. So let's talk about how we would write down a clef, and then we just get a better understanding for, again, what they mean and how they solve our problems. So clefs are symbols that you put at the beginning of stuff. They're squiggly lines, not like that. I'll show you what one looks like in just a moment. But you put them at the beginning of the stuff. And once again, they tell you which line and space correspond to which keys on the piano, which pitch are they. And so I draw, for example, a treble clef. And I'm sure this is a very famous symbol in the music world. Well, my drawing does not seem to be that amazing. But yes, I'm sure you must have seen this everywhere. and this is indeed what a treble clef looks like. And now by putting this at the beginning of the stuff, I have done two things. Now I know which line and space correspond to which pitch. And just to tell you, I can tell you for sure. For example, in a treble clef, this line means E, this line midline means B, and I can tell you all of them, in fact. But you don't have to memorize that right now. That was just to give you sort of brief understanding that that is what the clef is doing. But in addition to that, this treble clef is tuned towards the higher notes. That means this E is E over here and the right side. This treble clef talks about the right side. So when I want to write for high instruments which play up here, I use the treble clef, and I can write my music like this. Maybe something here, maybe something there. Oh, that's incorrect. Yeah, maybe something there, maybe something there, and writing my music. And if I want to dip slightly lower, I could use these small lines I was talking about. Again, you don't have to understand this too much. But if I truly wanted to go very low, or if you're talking about a low instrument here, then I will use a different clef altogether. For example, I wouldn't write for the bassoon in treble clef because it would just be these endless lines because it plays really, really low. So when I am talking about low instruments or things that play in a lower register, I'm going to use the bass clef. And just to give you an idea what the bass clef looks like, it looks something like this. So that's what the bass clef looks like. And again, so when this gets really low, when I want to write really low pitches, I'm going to use the bass clef. And under this, for example, this line may mean something else. It might mean G, and that would maybe be this G. So when I want to talk about the higher side, the right half of the piano, I usually use the treble clef because that it talks about those higher pitches. And when I want to talk about the lower half of the piano, I usually use, or instruments that play in the lower half of the piano, I usually use the bass clef because it refers to those pitches. And both of these clefs accomplish the main purpose that clefs are there for, and it is to tell us which lines and spaces correspond to which pitch. So hopefully that's given you some greater understanding of how this works, right? And really the only way this is going to make sense is through intuitive understanding. So of course you can always write things down in terms of theory and in terms of definitions, but it's all, at the end of the day, it's much better to get an intuitive understanding for how things work. So as we move forward, I'm sure that I'm going to be discussing the treble clef next, exactly which lines mean which pitch, and how that works, what are its structures, maybe even how to draw it, right? And hopefully as we go forward with that, you will get an intuitive understanding for how this works, because I understand this is a lot of information. And I also encourage you, if you feel you're drawing a complete blank right now, to pause the video and go back and rewind and rewatch some bits so you understand exactly what clefs are and what they mean. At the end of the day, clefs are, I'll just repeat again, they tell us which line of space correspond to which pitch on the piano. That's what their purpose is. And by using different clefs for different instruments, I can get around the problem where I have such limited space to write here. When I want to write for high instruments, I use the treble clef, and that automatically makes these lines correspond to very high pitches on the piano. And when I want to talk about lower instruments, when I don't want to use, like, I don't know, 5 different lines, right, because that gets again very hard to read, very hard to write, we use the bass clef. Why do we use the bass clef? Well, so because the bass clef makes these lines very, very low. So that's the main difference between the two. That being said, I would encourage you to rewind the video because this is a lot of information, and maybe try to reabsorb all of it. And if it still doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. It's hard for a lot of people at the beginning, and hopefully as we move forward and talk a little bit about the specifics about how the treble clef work and how the bass clef work, you'll get a much better understanding for why we use them and what they mean. That being said, I've covered everything I wanted to cover today. So I hope you have a wonderful day forward, and thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next class.